Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. I'm Anthony Rowley, a former president of the club, and I'll be acting as moderator today. And it's my pleasure to welcome today's guest speaker, who is William Lazonick, who is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts. And the title of his presentation today is Why the United States is Lagging in Critical Technologies. I think the timing couldn't possibly be better, given that Donald Trump has just been installed as President of the United States and seems intent on protecting its industries behind tariff walls, and also the DeepSeek saga, if that's the right term, I think has lent a particular relevance to this discussion today. Professor Lazonick's latest book, which in English is entitled Predatory Value Extraction, is due to be published very soon here in Japan, in Japanese, of course.
Well, it's out already. Yeah.
Pardon?
That's it, yeah. It's published.
Oh, it is. I'm sorry. It is published. I'm behind the times. It was actually published, several years ago in English. So I won't say any more. I'll let our speaker take the floor. But I was particularly struck by the sentence here that he will be warning that Wall Street's emphasis on a divest and distribute strategy creates more problems than solutions for reinvestment in critical technologies in the United States. So let me say no more, but let me remind you, if you have a mobile phone, please switch it off or put it on manner mode so that it doesn't interrupt the proceedings. Professor Lazonick, please.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go through this material, basically the argument fairly quickly, and leave time for discussion because I want to hear what people have to say. So basically, through a nonprofit that I run, the Academic Industry Research Network, we've been doing for quite a long time studies of different industries and looking at what we call corporate financialization, a problem that is, I think, really the American disease. And the most obvious manifestation of that, which I'll talk about, is companies buying back their own shares, which by and large is just a way of manipulating their stock price and does a lot of damage. And that will come into what I have to say today. And I'm going to talk very briefly about a number of different sectors in which we see this damage being done. Drug development, despite the fact that there's a huge innovation ecosystem in the United States supported by National Institutes of Health funding, which can be $40 or $50 billion a year. U.S. big pharma companies and also smaller startup biopharma companies are falling behind in global competition. In communications equipment, the U.S. does not have a major company that is a leader in 5G or IoT. And Cisco Systems could have been that leader, but I'll go over briefly why it failed to do so. In commercial airliners, obviously, it's a duopoly, Boeing and Airbus, and Boeing has fallen behind Airbus, and corporate financialization has a lot to do with it. It has a lot to do with the two crashes of the 737 MAX airplanes in 2008, 2009. Wind turbines, actually, by the turn of this century, all of the wind turbine manufacturers in the United States were under the control of Enron Energy. It went bankrupt, of course, famously in 2001, and General Electric took over the wind turbine industry, but it's lagging in global competition with only about 7% of the global market, and General Electric has other problems. EV batteries, it should be noted that although Tesla has been a pioneer in getting an EV car to market, mass market, the EV does not, there's no major producer of EV batteries that's based in the United States. It's coming out of Japan. Tesla's used Panasonic and now CATL in China for its cars in China. And CATL is now the world leader in batteries, and I'll get more into why that's the case. At least I'll give you a little bit of that. The semiconductor fabrication, this has been in the news a lot. Intel, really the pioneer in fabricating chips, producing chips, fabricating chips, a world leader. I think it just fell out of world leadership last couple of years, but it was for decades the world leader from the early 90s until the early 2020s, the world leader in chip revenues and a major fabricator, but it fell behind TSMC, Taiwan, and South Korea's Samsung Electronics. And then, just in the news today, I don't have a slide on this, but I have some ideas about it if anybody's interested. There's China's DeepSeek that's roiling the markets and everybody's worried about. Okay, I can only give a kind of a small part of the kind of analytical perspective used here, but I think the most important part of it is that you don't have a productive economy if you don't invest in productive capabilities. And so for maybe a decade now, I've been using this notion of the investment triad, that there's households, governments, and businesses that have to all be investing in productive capabilities in a kind of harmonic fashion. And it's a notion of a triad. And households obviously invest in the future labor force. They need the help of the government in terms of education. Government invests in infrastructure and knowledge base, not just public education, but higher education. And then we leave it to business corporations to actually get those products to market, to get us products that we want at prices that we are able or willing to pay. And that's where innovation come in, because all that investment in productive capabilities, if you don't actually make use of those capabilities in terms of goods and services that we use every day, then there's no value created. And just one word about the tech sector, which is largely what I'm looking at in the United States in looking at the lag in critical technologies, is that sector would not exist if it wasn't for Asian immigration. And a lot of that was quite deliberate with the Immigration Act of 1990, created very much increased the use of H-1B visas, L-1 visas, employment preferences, and immigration. And this is from a book that I have coming out. It's actually about African-American employment. I don't know if you can see the numbers there, but it's 12 Silicon Valley companies or tech companies. And Asian Americans, or people identify as Asian Americans, about 7% of the labor force. In many of these companies, this is professional workers. They're about 40 to 45% of the labor force. So those companies wouldn't exist without household units who identify as Asian, either immigration or second, third generation or whatever, work available in those companies. If you can see the numbers, you'd see that what used to be Hewlett-Packard, HP, that there's now two, HPE and HP Inc. There's only about, I think, 16% or so are Asian and way more whites. That's because as an old economy company, it built up its professional labor force before these other companies even existed, and it's still much more predominantly a white professional labor force. And actually has more African Americans than some of the others. But that's a longer explanation to get at that. The government agencies, the U.S., I know in Japan they talk about the developmental state. The U.S. is the most formidable developmental state in history. If anybody wants to talk about that, I can talk about that. And this is one, although probably one of the most important examples is the National Institutes of Health. You wouldn't, with its $1.6 trillion in expenditures since they started recording them in 1938 in current dollars, and about $40 or $50 billion a year. It doubled the expenditure between 1998 and 2004, as I indicate there, around the Human Genome Project, and also actually with the so-called threat of Iraq. It was, although people focused on the tubes and uranium, a lot of George Bush's speech, which led to the war in Iraq, was about bioterrorism, and that increased funding for the NIH. Okay, the business corporations that we rely on to invest in productive capabilities, they have to create value, and then some people are going to get to extract value. And if you want to understand the distribution of income in the economy, you want to understand ultimately the structure of power in the economy, you want to understand ultimately politics, you have to understand the value creation and value extraction relation within business corporations. And I'm not going to go into it analytically here, but basically I pose two different extremes. One extreme, which I think you have much more in Japan, and Ulrika Schad's here, and I read her most recent book, which I think points to this, is what I would call progressive value creation, that you're actually sharing the value that's created with the people who create the value, which is obviously people who go to work every day, and also taxpayers who help support companies through government agencies. The United States is at the other extreme. It's what I call it in the name of the book that came out in 2000 now, translated to Japanese, predatory value extraction. That's the people who are getting most of the money are not the people who created the value. And in fact, that I'll give you in a minute who those people are. Here is the way that book is structured. It's basically explained what an innovative enterprise is, and it also debunks the notion that the stock market is a value-creating institution. That is a way that companies get funded. It's not. It's a value-extracting institution. It's the way that those who have a claim on the company, mainly through shareholding, can take money out through dividends, and also the phenomenon that I'll emphasize, and which I frankly have made quite part of the debate through my work and myself and my colleagues in the United States, stock buybacks, companies buying back their own stock. That's the book in Japanese. The core of the book is 3 chapters about how this is done, which I call the value extracting insiders, enablers, and outsiders. And the insiders are the corporate executives themselves, and this is just a picture of the 500 highest paid executives in the United States year by year, in this case the CEOs, and you can see about 60 to 80% of their pay comes from stock-based pay, stock options or stock awards, and generally there's no performance requirement on this pay. If the stock price goes up, their pay goes up even if it crashes afterwards. There's no clawbacks, and stock buybacks in particular can help them get the stock price up. Then you have the rise of the institutional shareholder, become more and more dominant in the industry, and they have become the enablers because they, for various reasons, have the right to vote the shares in their funds, and also they can align with the third actor, and that is the ones who become really powerful, and these are the value extracting outsiders. And I use these numbers from 2016 just because they were available, and I compare them with CEOs in a second. But the ones underlined in red are the hedge fund managers who are activists who actually go into company and try to rip money out of companies and have been very successful, largely in doing so. And their pay, I don't like to call it earnings, their pay is way higher than even the top, in this case, top 15 CEOs, with one exception, Elon Musk, and I'm not going to talk about it. I can talk about it if you want. It's not in my slides, but why Elon Musk is the richest person in the world. We've written about this. Now, in general, this phenomenon, which is merely manifest predatory value extraction, and which I argue should just be outright banned, is companies buying back their stock on the open market. And for S&P 500 companies, this has been almost $7 trillion. In this case, over a decade, 2014, 2013, 57% of net income, on top of dividends, which are almost $5 trillion, 41% of net income. And there are some numbers that the largest companies repurchasers did, 28% of them as you'll see, I'll talk about Apple. Apple is the biggest corporate looter of them all, with $726 billion in buybacks between 2012 and 2014, over 12 years, and I'll come to Apple later. But the important point here is that the companies that have all this money and have a lot of capability. So remember, going back to what the economy depends on, investment of productive capability, they're the ones that are doing this buyback. This is permitted because of a once obscure rule that I've been writing about a lot, Rule 10b-18, it's called, from the Securities and Exchange Commission, where the Securities and Exchange Commission in 1982, under Reagan, brought in a guy from Wall Street who's pictured there named John Shad, and said, you can manipulate the stock market, but if you only do so much a day, then we won't charge you with manipulation. Well, for Apple, that can be $4 to $5 billion per day, day after day after day, and they'll stay within the safe harbor. For Microsoft, maybe 800 million. It depends on the stock price and the trading volume. Okay, but it's massive. The result of this, really, in the U.S. economy, increasingly people are making money out of money. And you just see, I could give you lots of different pictures, but this is just one of the divergence of the net worth at the top, 0.1% of 1% from the bottom, 50%. Important point here is that when you break that down, a large proportion of, an increasing proportion of of the total assets of the top 0.1% of 1% of richest households are financial assets, and of the financial assets, about close to 90% are of the total assets, close to 90% are financial assets. Now, of those financial assets, the part that's corporate equities from around 1990 has gone from 15% to now up to 45%. And also, as that money is being funneled to people who want to make money out of money, there's also been a huge growth in private equity, which is these, you see that line labeled at the bottom on corporate equity, the non-public corporate equity. And so this is the way people are making money out of money. And here you can also see it in income shares at top 0.1%. That bottom light blue space at the bottom, that's salaries. That's how it shows up in the reporting from the tax data, but actually most of that is stock-based pay. And this is just shows you the increase since before that Rule 10b-18 to up to 2019, looked at the same companies over those 39 years. And dividends remained around 50% of total net income, but buybacks went up from about 4% to about 62%. Okay, buybacks are different than dividends, because dividends you get for holding shares. Buybacks, the gains go to share sellers. People are in the business of timing the buying and selling of shares. Companies do buybacks not when the prices are low, but actually when the prices are high, because they're all competing against each other to try to keep the prices higher. Okay, and basically they undermine economic performance for two basic reasons. Company, to perform well, has to do two things at any point in time: invest for the future, where the next set of products is going to come from, because whatever's making you profits today are not necessarily going to be making you profits next year or the year after, and also paying for the past. This is paying for the people who are the value creators, so that they get rewarded, and also they continue to put their time and effort into working for the company. And when companies stop paying for the past and they start just paying to maximizing shareholder value, the productivity of the people in those companies falls. Okay. Let me just get into, there's a lot of different impacts of buybacks on income distribution, et cetera, but let me get into just very quickly the examples that I mentioned at the beginning. And I'm just going to give you a glimpse of each of these, and particularly in pharmaceuticals, we've done a lot of work. I can't even start to get into all the complexities of it, because there's a startup sector, there's a big pharma sector. But here, just one picture is that for the 14 pharma companies in the S&P 500 index from 2014 to 2013, they did more in dividends and buybacks than they did in R&D. Now, that isn't to say if they spent more on R&D, they would get more results, because just spending on R&D doesn't result in more of the productivity in R&D. And if the people at the top are focused on getting the stock price up, if they're neglecting the people who are actually have to deliver the product in terms of rewarding them, employment stability, et cetera, you're not going to get productivity of R&D. This is just a graph I saw recently of the Chinese, in this case, catching up with Americans in an industry where the Americans have assumed that they're the leaders. Already, European companies like Roche and AstraZeneca, or European-based companies, are out-competing the more financialized American companies. Here's a picture of Cisco. This data is up to 2022. I just used a graph that we had in a paper with Marie Carpenter on how Cisco turned from innovation to financialization. Since Cisco started doing stock buybacks in fiscal 2002 to the present, it's done $162 billion in buybacks, about 87% of their net income, about $68 billion in dividends, another 37% of the net income. By the way, that adds up to about 126%. People said, hey, where does that other 26% come from? It can come from taking on debt, consuming cash, selling off assets, laying off workers, et cetera, different in different companies. Cisco, we argue, could have been Huawei. Huawei is the world leader in communications equipment, the most sophisticated part of the telecommunications technology industry. Cisco was positioned to be challenged in that sector around 2000 after it had been achieved a position of the highest market capitalization of any company in the world. But then it started trying to keep its stock price up. Again, it's, you can read the paper, and there's a much more complicated story about why that's the case. A colleague of mine, Mustafa Erdem-Sakinc, had done his PhD thesis in France on comparing Airbus and Boeing. So after the second Boeing crash, we immediately wrote an article about the role of corporate financialization in the crash of the 737 MAX planes. Boeing, from January 2013 to the first week of March of 2019, did about $43 billion in buybacks. I guarantee you the top executives were being told again and again that it was a dangerous plane. They knew even when they built the plane that it was a dangerous plane, but they wanted to sell the planes, and they were doing those buybacks basically on earnings they had, because it was one of the fastest selling planes they ever had, going 9 years out, and then the planes crashed, and the company has crashed since then. Here's the picture of the buybacks that they were doing, and it's fallen behind Airbus, and there you can see comparison from 1999 to 2023. Airbus pays dividends, although less than Boeing, and 14% are buybacks. Those are almost exclusively shares they buy so that they can turn around and give them out to their employees at stock-based pay, whereas Boeing is 125% of net income in buybacks over that period. This is General Electric. That red line is their buybacks. This is an iconic company in the United States, company that backed Toshiba early in the 20th century in Japan. And it's been destroyed by financialization. That would always already going in that direction before a guy named Nelson Peltz, a hedge fund activist, came in there with less than 1% of the shares in 2015. And basically in 2016, the company, after having taken losses, had about $8.5 billion in profits. They did about $8 billion in dividends, and they did $22 billion in buybacks. And actually, Peltz himself didn't even win from that, because the company kind of crashed after that. They've actually now divested into 3 separate companies, one of which is energy. And as I said, they control all the turbine manufacturing for wind in the United States. Of all U.S.-based companies, but they're only 7% of the market and unlikely to gain any more. Intel, or the semiconductor industry, they started lobbying for subsidies which ultimately came the Chips and Science Act, $52 billion. This was started in June 2020 when Trump was president. It was passed in August 2022, the act which allows this. I pointed out at the time that I had no problem with the government supporting the semiconductor industry in the United States, but those companies that were major companies lobbying for it had done about 17 times in buybacks over the previous decades of what they were asking for subsidies. They actually tried to put very weak guardrails in the subsequent in the legislation, or at least the implementation by the Department of Commerce. The companies that were getting subsidies should not do buybacks. Intel basically destroyed itself through financialization. We've written a number of papers on this. This really shows you four CEOs who preceded the one who just got fired on December 1st, Pat Gelsinger. And I've been quoted in, I think it was an article in Yahoo Finance, that they should have fired the board, not Gelsinger. He was actually the right person to be at the company and trying to do what they were trying to do. But he was, by the time they brought him in, the company was already faltering in terms of falling behind TSMC and Samsung Electronics. And here are some of the data comparing their distribution to shareholders. Actually, even for TSMC, that 11%, 2001, 2010, that wasn't really buybacks on the open market. That was buying back shares of Philips, which stupidly sold back the shares to TSMC. They should have held on to them. But in any case, the numbers there are clear. Gelsinger, when he became the CEO, he said no more buybacks. This was the first time I ever heard any CEO say this. That was a condition of it taking the work. And he said because we got to get the industry running again. They fired him on December 1st. If anybody's interested, I can go into what I think are the reasons. I think actually the date is quite important, because the only real reason that I can find is that this was after the election, and he was too much, even though I would imagine he voted Republican his whole life. I don't know if that's the case, but he was very much aligned with the Biden administration on buyback issues. Apple, which I mentioned, the biggest repurchaser ever, they call it their capital return program, but the only time they ever got money from the stock market was in 1980 when they did their IPO, so they're not returning money to anybody. I go into how Carl Icahn, a hedge fund activist, put $3.6 billion into Apple shares in 2013, came away with a gain of $2 billion. Not 1 cent of that $3.6 billion went to Apple. The biggest predator of them all is Warren Buffett, who put close to about $39 billion into Apple shares starting in 2016, now has gained either realized or potential of $158 billion for doing absolutely nothing. And not 1 cent went to Apple. All he did was buy and sell shares. And while he held the shares, in both cases, Icahn and Buffett, they did record-breaking buybacks. So they did $95 billion on $94 million in profits last year. Sitting there while they're doing this is the CEO, who was also sitting behind Trump at his inauguration, Tim Cook, with his massive, I think I have there, $700 million in stock-based pay, and Al Gore, the former vice president, who's supposed to be Mr. Climate Change, never saying a word about them, just giving away all this money to shareholders and taking over about $123 million we calculated just on the shares he got as an Apple director. Okay, why does this matter? Apple could have invested in a semiconductor fab, and rather they outsourced it first, their high-end chips from the smartphones to Samsung and then TSMC, after actually Intel, which was doing all kinds of buybacks, turned it down. U.S. could have a state-of-the-art fabrication company at a fraction of what they've spent in doing buybacks. They also outsource all their, obviously, Apple products use rechargeable batteries. All their rechargeable batteries are outsourced to Amperex Technology, which is a spin-off of CATL, and that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, why the U.S. does not have a state-of-the-art battery producer. Okay, very briefly, I go in there 5 things that can be done to rectify this problem in terms of corporate governance: ban buybacks, change the way you pay executives, change who's on the board, change the way you tax companies, and support investment in productive capabilities. There is some legislation that's been influenced by this work sitting in Congress on this. It will unlikely to get passed anytime soon. This by Tammy Baldwin, senator from Wisconsin, on rescinding that rule back in 1982 and putting labor representatives on boards, and by Elizabeth Warren for the largest companies, giving them national charters, holding them socially responsible, and putting labor representatives on boards. I thought this I'd just show at a journalist talk. This is screenshots from the article by Joe Biden in the Wall Street Journal, and on the left is when it was published in 2016. He was vice president. He had read an article that I had written on stock buybacks and was really said that this had to be stopped. So the whole article is about how you got to get rid of this connection between buybacks and executive pay. He said the future of the economy depends on it. And it cites me, according to economist William Lazonick, gives some data from that article. On the right-hand side, it says, according to blank space, comma. This is after he became president. There only is one way that this could have happened, and that is someone in his entourage there did not want him talking about this issue, and they couldn't get rid of the article, so they get rid of my name. There's an article I have online. You can say, where did you go, Vice President Joe, where I rewrote his 2022 State of the Union address, where he didn't mention buybacks at all, but buybacks under Biden were at record levels. So something that he opposed as vice president, people around him couldn't see supporting as or opposing as president, and in fact it was very little mention of buybacks in the campaign. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Fascinating. Those slides were particularly interesting. I think, are they all contained in your book? If we want to.
No, well, so you can find most of the papers on the website of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, because the book is written 5 years ago, and some of these case studies have been published since then, some of the studies of these particular companies.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll open the floor now to questions. Working press first, please, if you are any members of the working press who would like to ask a question. If not, others, please. Perhaps I could just ask you one question very quickly, and that is, your theories or findings are controversial in some ways. I mean, you're saying that stock markets or stock exchanges are extractors of value rather than adding value. And you're saying it in a country here in Japan where the idea of stock market investment is being pushed very hard by the government through what's called the NISA program and so on, encouraging young people to open accounts from an early age onwards. So do you expect, or have you received much opposition to your theories?
Yeah, of course. Well, yes and no, because I find, at least over the course of my career, the people who who I've criticized actually tend not to respond and pretend, just go along their merry way. And in fact, even a lot of economists, and I'm trained as an economist and I've always worked as an economist, who might be critical of some of the outcomes, particularly on not so much, well, maybe on what I talked about today, but certainly something I didn't talk about today was just the impact on income distribution and on creating unstable employment, inadequate incomes. People I can name people like Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman. First of all, they don't talk about what goes on in the corporation. So what I'm talking about, I think they're smart not to talk about what I'm talking about, because they wouldn't know what they're talking about. Frankly, I'd be welcome if they were, but they don't. And so just an example. Stiglitz wrote an article several years ago about how drug companies were just using all their profits for marketing. And I I had written all this stuff about they're using it to do stock buybacks. I mean, that, you know, the marketing, okay, and actually it's a fraction of what the buybacks are often. So they just, there's a lot, and then there are people who differ with me. There's been some attempts to you know, critique my arguments, but when I go back and say, no, you're wrong, usually the debate ends. So, you know, I guess I could be a little less thorough in my critique and keep the debate going, you know, but I take that as a win for me when someone critiques me and then I come back and the debate ends. By the way, journalists have been very, very interested in this, and I have lots and lots of media attention. And partly is because journalists have told each other that if they call Bill Lazonick, and he'll talk about this stuff. And some are interested, some get it. But the ones who do get it, there have been a lot of really good stuff written by journalists, and not just in the United States, in Japan, in China, in Europe, on the things I've been talking about.
Okay. Yes, over there, please. Could you come to the microphone, say who you are, and ask your question, please?
Yes, I'm Naomi Fink from Nikko Asset Management. Oh, thank you. I guess my question comes more from curiosity about institutional design. As we learned from Darren Acemoglu, Nobel Prize winner, one of the things that tends to destroy growth in the long term is moving from inclusive to extractive institutions, or perhaps having an extractive setup in institutions to begin with. Now, in Japan, we're in a very curious, we're in a very maybe advantageous time where we're just emerging from 30 years of deflation, and there's an opportunity to reimagine a lot of the market functions and institutions. So I think Kishida called it new capitalism, but what would you suggest in terms of institutional and market design so we can avoid this cautionary tale of what appears to be going from inclusive to extractive and therefore long-term damaging growth?
Yeah, well, I think it's in some ways straightforward. If you recognize that people create value, they go to work, and that's where the value comes from, and that's respected, then you're likely to remain inclusive. You're likely to create more value, create more employment opportunities, and it seems to me that that's what Japan has been able to do. And again, I mentioned Ulrika Schada's book, she had to leave early, but Japan Reemerges. What she argues in that book, which I think originally came out in Japanese, is that this kind of, let's say, constraint on Japanese companies, which were maintained, is you don't just do mass layoffs of people when you get into trouble, means that some of them failed, but some companies found a new way to make use of the productive capabilities. And so, as a general rule, I would say any company that's grown to and all the companies I'm talking about are companies that become profitable and could reinvest in the future, are really critical companies for the use of those productive capabilities if they respect where they came from and they argue and they are oriented toward making use of them by generating new types of products for new types of markets that are related to the capabilities of the people in the company and the new people they bring in, then those companies are likely to continue to create value, and the value will be extracted by the people who create the value, not by the financial interests. And if those companies can prevail in preventing laws and preventing basic change in institutions of the type that now prevail in the United States, then they can succeed. And I think that's actually part of the battle that's going on. In my own work, I mean, not just in Asia, but also in Europe, a lot of it's been saying don't import the U.S. disease, and you know, but the U.S. disease is there, and it's since the late '80s it became very common for a company. You read a headline: "Company lays off 5,000 workers, stock price soars." It's what I call it. It's actually downsize and distribute is the term. I do not divest and distribute, but that companies go from retain and reinvest to downsize and distribute. Now, I should also say that when the Japanese companies challenged the United States in automobiles, consumer electronics, steel, machine tools, memory chips in the 70s and 80s, it was not in industries where the U.S. was weak, as where the U.S. was strongest. And what Japanese companies is they integrated skills on the shop floor with engineers and people in the management structure. And that was really the Achilles heel of American industry. There had been a historic separation of management from labor in terms of learning processes. But if you, nevertheless, up until the 1980s, and even for some companies into the 1990s, they honored an institution which was very much like the Japanese lifetime employment institution, which I call a career with one company. And for members of unions, this was enforced by seniority and that first hired, last fired, and job security. But for white collar workers, it was just in the post-war 2 decades, companies competed for workers, trained those workers, and retained those workers, and people had defined benefit pensions, which manifested this because they were just non-portable. You couldn't take them to another company, years of service with the company. That all totally vanished in the United States. Actually, one of the iconic companies for giving permanent employment in the U.S., IBM, did that in the early 90s. It went from about 370 or 80,000 employees to 220,000 employees in 5 years after claiming it had never laid off anybody involuntarily since the 1920s. And that was deliberately an implementation of basically shareholder value ideology, that the company just should be run for shareholders. And and I can give you lots. And once IBM did it, lots of other companies followed suit. And the whole society became oriented around and accepting this kind of downsize and distribute orientation to companies.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, I'm Doug Montgomery with Global Connects Media. So I got kind of 2 questions and a statement, but it seems to me you're really kind of arguing more for like a stakeholder capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism. That is one. You can just make a comment on that. And the second one that I thought you said was very interesting is fire the board, right? So we have a really tight, incestuous relationship between the board and the CEO. And that is a big problem. You can give me many examples, so can I. So I just kind of like get your comments on those two.
Yeah, okay. So on the first one, I think actually historically the stock market as a value extracting institution actually has a positive function. And that is companies grow. There are professional managers in those companies. They're not always going to be owned and controlled by founding dynasties or whatever. And actually that was the mode of getting that by the 1920s, most major U.S. companies were run by their salaried managers or employees. I used to work with a business historian, Alfred Chandler, who wrote a book, The Visible Hand, The Managerial Revolution of American Business, and that book ends around 1920, that you have the rise of the salaried manager. Okay, so they now have control in terms of allocation of resources, and they have hopefully the ability, hopefully the incentive to invest for the future and reward for the past, as I say, to think about themselves as running an organization rather than working for shareholders. And basically, until the rise of this overt ideology of shareholder value ideology, which is often I think rightly at origin in a 1970 article by Milton Friedman in the New York Times, but then a guy named Michael Jensen elaborated this with others, and then he was hired at Harvard Business School in 1985, and then you see all the hits in the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, about shareholder value only around that time. That companies were run basically for their organizations, and if they were successful, they paid a certain amount of dividends to shareholders. Most of those shareholders were household, or what's called retail shareholders. And so it's a good way of people who have some discretionary income, including their retirement income, saving and getting some of the money from the most successful companies. So I'm not against dividends unless they're too high. There is a problem, however, when you get a very unequal distribution of income, is not that many people actually directly or indirectly own stock. So they said like the top 10% of the United States have about 85% of the stock. So that in itself can contribute to income inequality, even if it's just dividends. So, but my argument is not against dividends or the stock market as an institution in that sense. It's against the notion that only the shareholders have a claim on profits, and I've critiqued that argument. So it is a type of stakeholder argument, and I also agree with people that would say those stakeholders should actually, to get to the next part of the question, should be on the board and should have some representation. So if I'm paying taxes, as I do, and a lot of that money is used to supply infrastructure and knowledge that companies use, I want them to pay a certain corporate tax rate to pay me back as a household. If I go work for the company, obviously, and I'm producing the innovations that give them enormous profits, I want to get more job stability and more higher income, not less because of that. So I want to be able to advocate for that. And in some industries, I would say even the consumers should have representation on boards. And that is something.
Not just with their
yeah, on boards, because there's a question of what kind of products are they producing? Are they producing safe products? Are they, and yeah, so this is a much bigger argument. In another talk I gave here at Meiji University, and I use this example a lot because I don't know if people know about this article by Milton Friedman in 1970. It said the social responsibility of companies increases profit. And Milton Friedman, of course, was a well-known conservative economist from Chicago. And that our argument actually was made in a particular context, which is important, that there had been a proposal to put 3 public interest people on the board of General Motors to advocate for safer cars, more fuel-efficient cars, and for more hiring of African Americans and better treatment of African Americans.
in 1970.
1970. Okay. African Americans actually were becoming a much more important part of their labor force, not just because of affirmative action, but because white workers were not that interested. They were upward mobility and interest in the automobile industry. Okay, that was overwhelmingly defeated by the board. And then when they set up a committee to look into this, someone at New York Times recruited Friedman to write the article and editorialized about it at the beginning, saying Friedman calls this type of, even looking into this things, pure and unadulterated socialism. Okay, now what that actually was, if we think about the automobile industry in retrospect, it was the future of the automobile industry, safer cars or fuel-efficient cars, having to find a good labor force to work at, that sees it as a real opportunity to work at these companies rather than just something they have to do. And they should have put those people on the board, not out of corporate social responsibility, but for the sake of the future of the company. And then in the slides I show after that, I show how the company's declined since that time in lost market share because it hasn't done those things. So how you actually invest for the future is not something that the people who are on boards now have an interest in. Of course, they technically hire the CEO. The CEO doesn't necessarily have an interest in it. You're right. In the United States, it's incestuous. Calling a board member an independent board member is just nonsense. Just to be extreme, I mentioned Musk. So basically, it was in the news. One of the way he became the richest people in the world is just giving himself 25% of Tesla stock as part of his pay, which is an enormous amount. And the last time he did that was in 2018. It was 12% of Tesla's outstanding stock if the company was able to mass produce its Model 3, which it was. Okay, that stock actually, which has been challenged in court, that payment twice now, and it's not clear he's going to get it, but that is now worth maybe about $80 billion. Okay, immense amount. The board, we looked at the people who were on the board at the time. He was the chairman of the board. We looked at the other people, and they were who were called independent directors, other than his brother and one of them, who is now the chair of the board. She made $83 million from in maybe 8 years on the board, and has stock options that may be worth $270 million more. Is she independent? Okay, there was one woman who was only on the board for 3 years, from 2016 to 2019. It later came out that she had criticized Musk for using drugs and for being volatile, so her position on the board was not renewed. Her total gain from stock-based pay from the 3 years was $135,000. Now, why is that? Because her stock options didn't vest. So we calculated that she had stayed on the board until 2021, when her stock options would have vested. That would have been $173 million. You can see the stakes there. So in retrospect, would she have spoken out against Musk? Maybe not, maybe yes. All credit to her if she would have, but there was a huge cost. And they're all aware of this. And it's actually, those type of data are very difficult to collect. They're not published, so we have to kind of hand collect those data. But it's nonsense. They're all patting each other's nests, and when they go in the financialization route, they're all in for it, and they sit there like Al Gore. I mean, actually, I don't know how many journalists I've spoken to. I've said, go interview Al Gore and ask him why he was sitting there while Apple was doing 60 billion, 70 billion, 80 billion buybacks a year, when they could have taken some of that money and put it into companies doing climate change. Why no one ever did, to my knowledge, and he's never said anything. And Apple, when they've done this 726 billion in buybacks, there's nothing in their public annual reports or public filings which say, oh, this is why we're doing it. They just do it. Now, the reason they're doing it is very simple. If they don't do it, they'll lose their jobs for the reason I gave, because these powerful hedge fund activists. So they just keep quiet and they do it. And then Tim Cook goes and sits behind Donald Trump, and and the beat goes on, and it gets worse and worse. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to just ask you, who can be the principal agents of change to change this culture of predatory value extraction? I mean, what is the role of institutional investors, for instance, pension funds and insurance companies and so on?
Well, yeah, I think that I'm in the knowledge creation business, so that if people understood what's going on, maybe they would say we need change. So that's the first step, is just getting the people who need to understand how this stuff works to recognize this what's going on. And they've had some success in that, but I would say not enough. And it has to be more, frankly, besides me and the people I work with, there are not a lot of other people doing these kinds of studies of these companies. Okay, so that's the first problem. But if people understood what was going on, yes, they could say, I want my pension fund to vote in certain ways. They could have an influence on this, which they do not have. And Sometimes they do it. For example, the AFL-CIO, the big umbrella union organization in the United States, has shareholder proposals, but sometimes they're not. They think that they're dealing with the problem, but often they're not. I mean, there are problems. So there are people out there who have shareholder proposals that but they tend to get defeated. They tend often not to really, in my view, understand the problem. There could be more intelligent, and it's not a movement. It's sort of, it's done here, it's done there. It's not something that people are saying, I'm going to work and I'm paying into a pension fund and I want to make sure that other people can go to work because my pension fund isn't putting them out of work for the sake of higher yields for me. And sometimes those higher yields don't even occur.
Okay, all right. Also, what is the principal motivation for share buybacks? You've talked a lot about share buybacks. They amount to a reduction of capital, as far as I am aware. So, what drives the desire for?
Okay, so first of all, if you think of it, you have the stock market out there, and people are obviously, it's driven by three things. The stock market is driven, first of all, by innovation. So take a company like NVIDIA, which is now sky high, although it's fallen in the last few days, but went up to $3 trillion market value. By the way, Intel could have bought that company for $20 billion in 2005 and spent more on buybacks in the 3 years surrounding it. Then, all of a sudden, ChatGPT is released. People realize that the AI chips or the graphic chips, basically that NVIDIA has, could be very useful in AI, and they're developing AI chips. And so there's going to be, because of the fact that all of a sudden their revenues have grown tremendously, that the stock price should be higher. Okay, but most people recognize that after the fact because they're not studying what's going on in the company. Then what happens is speculation kicks in. So that's the second thing that drives the stock market. People say, okay, I should have invested. It's going to go higher. And then there's what I subscribe to. I don't know where it comes from, but it's called the greater fool theory, that people keep, bidding the stock price up, assuming there's a greater fool than them, and then the greatest fool get left holding the bag, But then the third thing, which they discovered with buybacks, was manipulation. And as I said, even the Securities and Exchange Commission has never said they're not manipulation. It just says you can do it, and we won't charge you with manipulation. And basically, that's what open market purchase is about. So there's actually 4 parts of the process. Companies will announce that they're doing a buyback program, but that's not actual buybacks. They'll just say, we're going to do $10 billion in buybacks over 4 years, or there might not be any or indefinite period of time. And it's just an announcement that's made. Usually, studies show the stock price goes up 2-3% when they do that. Then they actually do the buybacks. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, doesn't require them to say when they're going to do them. So and even after the fact, you don't know the days to do it. But anybody's in the business of timing the buying and selling of shares just knows when they're going to go on. So that then once all of us looking, if you're looking at the stock price sitting there, or people who are working as not in the know and as analysts, they're going to see the stock price go up, and so they start speculating on this. And then the quarterly report will come out, and actually earnings per share will be higher. And you might say, oh, earnings per share are higher, not because earnings have gone up, they might have even gone down, but because they've reduced the denominator. And then that should lead to people to say, well, maybe there's a problem here, but it tends to increase the price even more until it doesn't increase the price. Then you have a case like Intel, having done $142 billion in buybacks over 20 years and falling behind and saying no more buybacks. But by that time, it may be too late. But it's a manipulation. It's manipulation, pure and simple. That's what it's about, by and large.
Thank you. We've got time, perhaps just one quick question. Do we have another question from the floor? No? Okay, well, thank you very much. I think it's, as I said, absolutely fascinating and very timely. When the book is on sale for those who came into the room late at various bookshops here.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Yes.
I see.
All right. Well, thank you for coming to and explaining it to us, and it's given me certainly an appetite to look further into the issue. So perhaps we'll invite you again to come back and
Be happy to.
elaborate on what you've said
Yeah.
today. In the meantime, please join me in thanking Professor Lazonick.
Thank you.
Sorry, we do offer our guest speakers a 1-year honorary membership. It hasn't been given to me at the moment, but I will make sure that.
Okay. Well, then I'll have to come back to Japan to take advantage of it. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. Okay. I do have to.